Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight to our Mountain Voices lecture. I'm Kayla Brzezinski. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Museum of the White Mountains. Our lecture tonight continues a conversation that began with our recent summer exhibition, The White Mountains: A Crossroads, which many of you may have had the chance to experience before it closed. That exhibition explored the ways in which the White Mountains may have served as a place of intersection of people, cultures, ideas, and traditions. Today, we turn our attention to one of the region's most cherished traditions, Old Home Days in New Hampshire. These gatherings, rich in history and community spirit, have long served as moments of reunion, reflection, and pride for towns across the state. They offer a lens through which we can understand not only the evolution of community identity in New Hampshire, but also the broader cultural shifts that have shaped rural life in New England over the past century. This lecture will explore how Old Home Days, born in 1899 as a nostalgic lure for former residents, transformed rural New Hampshire into a stage, shaping both its identity and its future for generations to come. We're joined tonight by Andy Colpitts. Andy is a theater artist and PhD candidate at Cornell University in the Department of Performing and Media Arts. He holds a BA from Brown University in Theater and Performance Studies and Comparative Literature, and an MA from Cornell University in Performing and Media Arts. So please join me in welcoming Andy.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for that introduction, and thank you, Thomas, for doing tech. Thank you to folks that are here online. Thank you to folks that are here in person. I'm really delighted to be here this evening because Plymouth State University also has a family connection for me. My father came here in the 70s as a student, or early 80s. My grandparents actually met here when it was Plymouth Teachers College, and my great-grandmother came here when it was Plymouth Normal School. So kind of generations. So it's a delight to be here. Also, thank you so much to Megan, who invited me here back in the spring when curating the summer exhibition, the Crossroads exhibition. Okay, so before I begin the presentation, I'm curious if anyone here has been to or heard of Old Home Days before, or Old Home celebrations. Okay, or on the chat, if there is anyone. Okay, if not, then we'll just jump right in. And I'll begin a little bit with my own experience of Old Home Days or Old Home celebrations more broadly. It began when I was very little and going to the Tilton and Northfield Old Home Days every year for the first 8-ish years of my life. And there are potato sack races, pie eating contests, parades, fireworks, all of these things that are often typical of a lot of Old Home Days throughout New Hampshire and throughout New England. At the same time, each Old Home Day is unique, and I'm going to talk about that at the very end, sort of what Old Home Days look like today, what they mean for people today. A lot of them are run entirely by volunteers. They have local groups that are represented, selling food, doing dunk tanks, all of these kind of local events, and it's really to bring local communities together with an emphasis on town history and heritage and tradition. And at the same time, one thing that really kind of struck me about Old Home Days, not when I was little, but later, looking back on it and kind of fondly remembering that, is why is it Old Home Days, right? These celebrations are filled with people who live in these places, for whom it's not an old home, it's their present home. And that really made me think about the kind of nostalgic framing of these events, which I would argue kind of echoes a broader cultural idea about rural life as being something that is of the past, that is, small towns are frozen in time, or they're stuck in the past, or really pejoratively, backwards, right? And these celebrations are somehow linked, somehow interfacing with these cultural ideas of what rural life is. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, let me give a little background on how this started. What are Old Home Days? Where did it come from? So the central kind of narrative around Old Home Days, as it's told, begins at the tail end of the 19th century. In the late 1900s, rural New England was in decline, is the narrative. In particular, there was this profound anxiety that rural areas were being depopulated, that people were moving away, they were moving out west, they were moving to big cities, and rural towns were just kind of getting gutted, leading to this generalized fear and anxiety that rural life in New England was kaput, and people were in desperate search for a solution. Enter New Hampshire Governor Frank Rollins at the time. In 1899, Governor Frank W. Rollins called on towns throughout the region to organize what he dubbed Old Home Week. This was meant to be a week to invite those, quote, sons and daughters of New Hampshire who had left their home state to return for a week in the summer. This celebration would be filled with performances, games, exhibitions, parades, group suppers, dances, and so forth. All these things to remind the returners of just how good it was back in their old home that they had left. The goal for this scheme was pretty simple. By showing those who'd left a good time, they might be inspired to return permanently. Or if not permanently, then maybe they would at least buy a second home. Or if they couldn't buy a second home, maybe they would donate money to help build a library or a new schoolhouse. Or at the very least, they would be injecting money into these rural towns for the space of that week. So the idea, in short, was to turn the warm and fuzzies of nostalgia into cold, hard cash. And this was the general scheme of the Old Home movement. And I really call it a movement because while most of it centers on these celebrations that happened, it was also an entire mentality. And people at the time, when it first started, called it a movement, right? They saw it as this really kind of bootstraps movement for rural revitalization that extended beyond the annual celebrations. Okay, so that's the general story as it's been written by a number of people. The story is retold in local newspapers, magazines, historical society web pages, and in a factual sense, it's true. None of those things are factually false. But what that narrative doesn't tell us is where the idea came from for the Old Home movement, so the precursors, except to ascribe it in this sense to this kind of great man of history theory where Frank Rollins had this idea out of nowhere, right? It's not true. And I'll be talking about that for the first half of the talk. Also, this basic story doesn't give us a way to think critically about this movement and the lasting impact that it had on New Hampshire and New England, both positive and negative, and some, mixed things all together. In other words, I don't think that the most interesting question about the Old Home movement is, did it work or not, right? One, that's tremendously hard to quantify. And rather, I want to ask, not did it work, but what work did it do? What were the changes that it brought about? So I want us to begin with this image. This is a show curtain at the Mount Israel Grange over in Sandwich. And I came across this curtain at the Old Home Week in Sandwich last year. Downstairs, there was a display of local collectors, that had collected stamps and military paraphernalia, and some people brought in their vegetables that they had grown, but different collections of things that they were exhibiting. And that was happening downstairs at the Grange, and that's what brought me to the Grange. And as I was going through, people kept asking, have you seen the curtain? Have you seen the curtain? Have you seen the curtain? I kept saying no. And but it was right upstairs. And so after seeing these different exhibitions, I went upstairs and found this really stunning curtain. And I'll give us a slightly closer look. This curtain was painted by Fred George Quimby around the turn of the 20th century, somewhere between 1892 is the earliest date that we have, or maybe 1915, somewhere in that 25 years. And as you can see, it shows a little farmhouse at the end of a dirt lane, nestled in amongst the hardwood trees in the shadow of Mount Israel. In the foreground, a woman in a white dress and bonnet stands on a bridge over the Bear Camp River, and this is a real place that you can go to. And she looks wistfully off toward the setting sun at the left-hand side of the image, as if she's looking into the past, right? Because we read from left to right, so she's looking back into the past in a way. And some in the town actually believe that this person was Fred George Quimby's childhood sweetheart, Belle Forbush. And this whole scene, as you can see all around, is also painted with a gilt frame. And that's not a real frame, it's also painted onto the canvas. It's a beautiful image, and it's very romantic. And so to say a little bit more about Quimby, he was born in 1863 to a prominent family in Sandwich. If you go to Sandwich today, there's Quimby this and Quimby that all over the town. And it was painted in the same moment as the old home movement began. And it's interesting because Quimby himself is kind of an old home movement figure. He is one of these people that was born in Sandwich, but then as a young man left and moved to Boston to, gain his fortune as an artist, as a portrait artist, and later a landscape artist. But held this, relationship to his hometown and painted his old home in this show curtain. I also begin with this curtain not only because it is an artifact of the old home movement and kind of gives a certain aesthetic of the old home movement, but it is also a perfect metaphor for the way that I've come to understand the old home movement through archival research as well as ethnographic research, going to old home days and doing interviews, speaking with folks, and really experiencing what it's like today. And what I mean when I say it's a perfect metaphor for it is because it's in a theater. This curtain represents the nostalgic imaginary of rural New England that was sweeping the nation at the turn of the 20th century. The New England homestead nestled in the mountains, the place of lost love, the place of childhood. And the curtain is this threshold between the real world off the stage and the supposed, world of the play, the fictional world behind it. And that's really what the old home movement is. It's this threshold between imaginaries of rural life in New England and the reality of it, and the way that actually understandings of rural life for tourists, but also for rural residents themselves in these towns, was moving back and forth across this curtain, from dramatized fictions to everyday realities. And this is what I call the dramaturgy of nostalgia, right? That's the title of this talk, because it's basically this understanding of rurality that's going back and forth with nostalgia at the center. For those who aren't theater scholars or theater makers, I want to talk about a little bit about the word dramaturgy. What is it? So it comes from Greek, dramatos, meaning action, play, theater, essentially, and urgia, meaning work, science, sometimes to write. So what dramaturgy is the whole making of theater. It's the structure. So that's all you need to know. It's, the study of the structure of theater, right? It's the making of theater in itself. And I use this term to emphasize the way the old home movement dramatized New Hampshire for tourists, in the way that a playwright or a director does for spectators. So if the old home movement was a process of theater making, playmaking, Rollins, again, the governor, would be the director. Instead of, as some at the time suggested, investing in small industry or agriculture as solutions for this rural problem that was being experienced at the turn of the century, Frank Rollins was drawn to nostalgia and to the romantic image of tourism. Well, most of his life wasn't spent in rural areas. He was the son of a New Hampshire senator and lived most of his life in Concord and later in Boston. But he would spend every summer going back to his childhood family farm in Rollinsford, New Hampshire. Yes, that his family helped settle. And throughout his entire life, he would speak and write in these really honeyed tones about the, quote, bright summer days of my boyhood, those halcyon days so soon past, so dearly cherished. And in a way, this economic scheme was an extension of his own emotional attachment to rural New Hampshire and the imaginary of it, built on an expectation that others would be attracted in the same way that he was to support struggling rural towns through this kind of feeling of nostalgia, which was, at once warm and fuzzy, but also has this yearning, has this feeling of loss and pity kind of baked into it. And this is what Rollins called the home sentiment. And Rollins referred to this as the home sentiment because at that time, nostalgia wasn't a word that was in the common lexicon, and it was still largely cordoned off to its traditional meaning, which was literally an illness. It literally meant homesickness. And so for this, I'm also going to give you some Greek. You didn't know you were getting a Greek lesson this evening. Nostalgia comes from nostos, which means homecoming or returning home, and algia, which is pain or grief. And it was coined in 1688 by a Swiss physician named Johannes Hofer to describe the feverish, dilapidated state that some young Swiss people would get into when they had to leave their homes and go into cities or go into different countries. And they would just mourn for their, alpine homes to the point where they would have fevers, depressions, even death if they weren't brought home. So it really was this pathological experience for them. And he was the first to describe this and coin this term using Greek. He himself, of course, was not Greek. Over time, and especially in the 20th century, this sort of homesickness element of nostalgia eventually gave way to the definition that we have today, which is much less about a yearning for a certain place, and it's more about yearning for the past. But that didn't really happen until sort of halfway through the 20th century. In the 20th century, of course, this new meaning of nostalgia, the yearning for the past, has become very politicized and problematized and has really become a subject of study. And in one of these early studies of nostalgia, sociologist Fred Davis describes nostalgia as a coping mechanism, essentially, that the past is seen as a stable refuge in the face of rapid social, political, and cultural change. And again, if we think about that imaginary of rural life as the past, as being something frozen in time, stuck in the past, right? We see this kind of trend emerging between the old home movement and the desire to go home and the desire to go to the past, the place of childhood. But Davis, here we are, Davis also has this idea about nostalgia not only being something that we feel, but also a kind of style, if you will, that exists in art in the material world. He said, nostalgia is not only a feeling or mood that is somehow magically evoked by the art object, but also a distinctive aesthetic modality in its own right, a kind of code or patterning of symbolic elements, which serves as a substitute for the feeling or mood it aims to arouse. So essentially the idea that, you can look at a piece of art like Quimby's painting and say, oh, that is nostalgic, right? Painting doesn't feel anything, but it evokes that feeling. And this is how Davis described that. All of that to say, I don't think that Frank Rollins knew about all of this history of nostalgia, but somehow was tapping into it, and tapped into it in this very interesting way when he dubbed New Hampshire the Switzerland of America. Somehow that was just deep in him. And here we see him at the very top, kind of presiding over all of New Hampshire, over its mountains and these homes of different New Hampshire dignitaries. And also some dogs at the bottom. And this move, right, this portraying New Hampshire as the Switzerland of America, of course, part of that is coming from the fact that already New Hampshire was seen as a tourist destination for people wanting to go to the mountains, you know, up to the grand resorts that existed in the mountains. But he was trying to move away from just that to really generalizing tourism throughout all the towns of New Hampshire, again, as this rural revitalization strategy. And so the other reason that I insist on talking about the Old Home movement instead of just Old Home Days or Old Home celebrations is that this nostalgic mentality that we're seeing was really on the rise already before Rollins proclaimed the first Old Home Week. So let's talk a little bit about where those ideas came from. So this is the set for a 1886, the set's from 1887, but 1886 play called The Old Homestead that was written by Denman Thompson. And some people say that this was the most lucrative play to ever have been produced in the United States at the time. The Old Homestead is this very, again, nostalgic, we would call it today, piece of theater. It's the story of a prodigal son who has gone missing in the city, but it's told from the perspective of his father, Joshua Whitcomb, who lives on the Old Homestead in West Swansea, New Hampshire, which is a real place, West Swansea. We'll come back to that. Lives in West Swansea, has to go to New York City to find his son Reuben, which, for those of you familiar with the term, is where we get the term rube. To describe a rural person as a rube, comes from the name Reuben. He goes to New York City, finds him, he's drunk and penniless on the streets, and he has to bring him home, clean him up so that he can take over the family farm, which he does and is so happy to have done, and there's a very happy ending. So in this way, it's kind of an old home story already in itself. It's a story of rural return. That really taps into the anxiety that people were already feeling about the depopulation, young people leaving and not coming back, which is, of course, still something that people are talking about today. What's interesting about this play is that for audiences that were seeing it, and it played all over the place. It opened in Boston, it played for several years on Broadway, and then it toured for about 20 years. For the people that watched it, many of whom were living in large urban centers, they saw this as extremely realistic. The technical term is verisimilitude, that this was so true to life. One critic said, this is a marvelously lifelike picture of home in New England. That, quote, no dramatist on earth could have fashioned out of his imagination. Another critic emphasizes how it is, to the least significant detail, faithful to nature. Was this play realistic? No, it was not. In the middle of the first act, a quartet of farmers come on and sing in perfect harmony out of the blue, The Old Oaken Bucket. Just 'cause. Directly, speaking out to the audience. So it was not a naturalistic play in any traditional sense, but it was clearly tapping into something that audiences wanted to believe was truthful, wanted to believe was realistic. In other words, it legitimized their nostalgia. This play offered something of a touristic visit to rural New England without ever having to leave the city. They could just go to the theater and feel like they were there. But at the same time, there is something that is realistic in this, in that Denman Thompson set the play in his hometown of West Swansea. While he wasn't born in West Swansea, his parents were. He was born outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, but moved back to West Swansea as a teenager and lived there for several years before himself moving to Boston to become first an actor and sort of stagehand, and later playwright. His big break came in the 1870s when he was in bed in Pittsburgh, very ill, kind of delirious. And he had the only thing that brought him solace was thinking back to his life in West Swansea and the people that he had left behind there. And this inspired him to make a solo act. So he created this personage, this character of Uncle Joshua Whitcomb, who was a composite made from two real people that lived in West Swansea, Joshua Holbrook and Otis Whitcomb. So again, we're taking these two real things and squishing them together to create this fictional stage Yankee. And he had huge success with this act, which he then turned into the Old Homestead with this character as the star vehicle at the middle. And at the time, he was, an extremely famous performer on the vaudeville circuit and on the legitimate stage. And what's interesting about Thompson is in his offstage life, again, we're moving back and forth on and off stage. In his offstage life, he prefigures the old home movement. He's almost the archetype of exactly what Frank Rollins would have wanted from all of the other ex-rurals that had moved into cities. In that, he moved back to Swansea at least bought a second home in Swansea in 1879. He bought the home that his mother had grown up in, demolished it, and built a 22-room mansion for $200,000, which at the time, an enormous sum, right? He was extremely rich, having produced this play, and also became a benefactor of the town, giving lots of money to different municipal causes. So this is exactly what Rollins would have wanted, right? Of someone yearning for the home that they had lost and eventually coming back and injecting financial and economic stimulus into it. That said, I don't know, and I've tried so hard to find out whether Frank Rollins saw this play, saw the Old Homestead. I can't find proof that he did, but given that it was as popular as it was, I think that he would have at least known about it. And what's interesting about this play, the Old Homestead, let's go back to this image, is also then the overlap with the old home movement itself, with old home celebrations. This show they started a yearly production of this show in West Swansea, in the town that it was about, in the 1930s, which continued until 2017. So for, the better part of a century, they would have a production every single year, often performing it at old home celebrations. And in these performances, local actors would play the same roles year after year, fusing their own real life identities with these characters. And the director of the Centennial production, the Old Homestead Centennial production in 1986, and the director was from West Swansea, when asked why the town stages the show year after year, he said, "It's not just a play. This is Swansea. It's about Swansea. It's about the people of Swansea. And each year people come back to relive the past." And at its height, this annual ritual drew hundreds of spectators. But yes, it eventually, lost participation and sort of enthusiasm around it and stopped in 2017. In his book, Turn and Jump, New Hampshire writer Howard Mansfield writes about the Old Homestead as a, quote, catalog of lost life and, quote, a visit to exhibits of the nostalgic past. And so I think this really kind of shows the way that understandings of rural life were moving back and forth between depictions on stage, fictional, or at least fictionalized, and the real world that they're existing in, facilitated by these old home celebrations, to the point where even rural communities were using these fictional depictions to better understand themselves. At the same time, this was also happening in other art forms, which were quickly becoming obsessed with this idea of the old home. In 1895, New Hampshire poet Emma Weston published a collection called The Old Home. And in 1898, a songwriting duo, Andrew Sterling and Harry Von Tilzer, wrote a hugely popular song called My Old New Hampshire Home. And let's listen to just a little bit of that to get a sense for how that sounds. Okay, thank you so much. So what I think is interesting about this song, it's a very beautiful song, actually. I think, it's very tuneful. But I don't think the most interesting thing about it is its kind of nostalgic schmaltz. It's actually that neither of the writers of this piece were from New Hampshire. Andrew Sterling was from New York City, and Harry Von Tilzer was born to Polish immigrants in Detroit. So what was it, I wonder, that made them write this song at this point? And all I can really think is that already there was this enormous kind of zeitgeist around the old New Hampshire home, or the old New England home more broadly, which we can see here. These are also pieces of sheet music that were written in the I think decade following Sterling and Von Tilzer's song. And what's, I think, really striking about these is that the old home in these images is identical. The composition of these images is the same, right? You have the old home nestled against trees on the left, again, in the past, as this road passes by, or in this case, a stream in my old home in Vermont. And all of these, in terms of the songs, have these same kind of longing narratives where it's either a young woman that's been left behind or the mother that the singer misses so much. And it's always from the perspective of a man, which, again, is very interesting. All of this is very masculine, all of this nostalgia, which we can talk more about in questions if you want. But to the point where, the old home in Enter the Name of New England State Here became this kind of cultural trope is really fascinating. And this actually, as you might recognize, is the very same composition that we get, from this image, right? With the same road heading down with the house on the left in the setting sun, right? And all of that symbolism, I think, is not unintentional. And if we look at this this set where we're inside the old home, again, we have the same image, the road coming up, and you would imagine that it passes on the other side. And so if you were out down on that road, you would get that same exact image of the old home, except here we're inside of it. Okay, so what I want to suggest about all of those cultural artifacts that we've just looked at is that in a way they were scripts for the old home movement that Frank Rollins already had in his mind, or that were existing in the culture around him at the time. But if that's one half of it, there's also the kind of practical element of the old home celebrations, which were these gatherings, which again, he did not necessarily have the original idea for, because town gatherings like this were really on the rise following the National Centennial in 1876. These kind of new annual celebrations coming out of the hoopla of the centennial, focused more on heritage and recognition of the past. In 1877, Reverend and Mrs. James T. Jackson of Cornish, New Hampshire, organized a reunion for a handful of elderly folks of the town in the hopes of cheering an aged widow in town who was very sad. This is just an example of the kind of event that I'm talking about. The 18 attendants, some from town and some from neighboring towns, were said to, quote, forget that they were old people and again become boys and girls as of long years before. Again, high nostalgia. Such was the success of the event that planning for the next year began immediately after the first one ended. The second reunion had 75 in attendance, the third 150, and by the end of the century, the annual Old People's Visit, as it was called in Cornish, was seeing between 300 and 800 people every year. So again, there was already this movement that was happening, and Rollins essentially struck while the iron was hot. So in 1899, he had this proclamation for Old Home Days, and 44 towns, including Sandwich, there we had the first image, celebrated Old Home Week. They had parades, speeches, lots of pomp. They lit signal bonfires in each of the towns to kind of show all of the towns that were celebrating in New Hampshire. And it wasn't just in New Hampshire that people were excited about this, but also New Hampshireites in other states. In California, a group got together on a beach in Monterey to celebrate. They traced out a map of New Hampshire in the sand and placed stones and shells all over it to show the towns that their families were from. So essentially, it was a huge success from the get-go. The next year's celebrations began immediately. Songs like My Old Home in New Hampshire, which we just heard, or The Old Oaken Bucket, which was in the Old Homestead, became standards in these celebrations. What's more, they began to spread quickly throughout New England. Maine held the first Old Home Week in 1900, Vermont in 1901, and so on. It eventually spread to other parts of the country and even into Canada. And for the first half of the century, there was a lot of engagement with this idea. The Old Home Days kind of grew steadily. At one point, there were over 100 towns in New Hampshire that would celebrate this every year and had a really powerful central organization for the first decade, headed by Frank Rollins until his death. And from the very beginning, it was intimately linked with other kinds of rural revitalization. So the Old Home Committee for the state was housed in the Board of Agriculture. The vice president of the Old Home Society had close ties to the Grange, and so it really had this kind of close connection with rural life in the state. Different representatives would come from each county, and for a number of decades, it actually received state funding to put this all together and create this sense of what Old Home Days should look like. And they had kept very close records, and it was, quite a big deal for a number of years. And in 1949, so kind of slightly after the peak of Old Home Days, there was this list of suggestions that were sent out. And I think this is really one of the best examples of the kinds of scripts. This is not, a script in the way of a staged play, but a literal script that the Old Home Week Association was giving to different towns to tell them how to put on these events. And some of these suggestions are logistical, send out invitations at this time, get this for these kinds of people for your board, and so on and so forth, all the way down to very particular suggestions. I want to highlight a few here. So promote Old Home Week interest by special newspaper articles, attractive invitations, stimulating letters, circulars, town advertising leaflets, booklets, radio speeches, historical facts, ring bells, take Old Home Day pictures. That happens before the Old Home Day. And then during the Old Home Day, feature parade, pageants, demonstrations, exhibits, old timers quartet in costume. What does it mean? Young people's chorus, essays, monologues, family reunions, races, ball games, special features, contests, award for the largest family attending, old time dances, Old Home Day play. So this begins to give you an idea of what these celebrations looked like and what the state wanted them to look like. Also, recognize former residents, old citizens, those that have lived in town the longest, largest family represented. Introduce town's oldest and youngest married couples, right? So there's this kind of dual thing of look at the history, the posterity, but also look at the new generation, the young people that are here. And number 9, very importantly, emphasize the advantages of your town, what it offers present residents and prospective farm and village home buyers, as well as summer residents. And again, we get this notion that this is partially for people that are living in these towns, but it also has this ethos of advertisement built into it, right? This is early nostalgic advertisement, pre-Mad Men nostalgic advertising. You have to look at this. So if that's kind of a sense of what Old Home Days looked like, I also want to think about the artifacts that the Old Home Day has left us with. The Old Home Days themselves, they disappear, right? We have sometimes photos, we have souvenir programs, but we can't go back to those events ourselves to know what they were like. So we're kind of dependent on the different artifacts that we're left with. This is a book that was made for Boston's 1907 Old Home Week. They also had them in cities for a short time. And James Ball Naylor wrote this book for Old Home Week with A-B rhyming. It's, very honeyed prose, or honeyed verse rather, about the country road, the farmhouse, the churchyard. They're all described in great detail. But their primary defining features seem to be that they are well remembered and long lost and same old and so on. They're generic, in other words. Even the friends of the central character in this, who's a businessman that goes back for Old Home Week to his small town, the friends have the most generic names imaginable: Johnny Smith, Bobby Brown, Jimmy Fuller, and Mandy Mills. And again, James Ball Naylor was not even from New England. So what we get, what's really remarkable about this story isn't the story itself, but the way that it envisioned the old home. So when this was published and it was distributed at Old Home Weeks throughout the region, it would always have a picture of what the old home looked like. And again, we get that same exact image of the road with the house on the left there. But in different places, it would look a little different. So if you bought it in New Hampshire, it would have this farm. If you bought it in Boston, it would have a picture of Boston. Which leads me to think that, in fact, the most honest version of this book is the one that lives at the Library of Congress, which has the page of the old home, but nothing, right? There's a kind of emptying out of significance of this image. It has become so generic, in other words, that it's literally a copy paste. Okay, so that leaves me with a really cynical theme of how we should think about Old Home Days. And I realize that we're nearly at time, or we are at time, so I'm going to finish up quickly on a more optimistic note, which is to say, This is a lot from my archival research, but in the ethnographic research of going to old home days today, you see something really different, which is so many people that are volunteering their time to support their local communities. And these since the kind of the centralization petered out in the mid-century, old home days have really come to be a lot more heterogeneous than they once were. There are still certain things that hold them together, that not least of which is the name, but in Foster, Rhode Island, for example, it's an agricultural fair. It's much more like a county fair, 4-H demonstrations, animal shows, and exhibits. Whereas in Sandwich, New Hampshire, it's much more about historical preservation and historical exhibition. In towns like Sherman, Maine, which is way up in Aroostook County, it's just a moment for the town to come together. This is a town that's, really, really far flung. And it's one of the central rituals for the town where they all get to see one another. And again, I would hear from people that were organizing these events that they were having less and less of these, that there were fewer and fewer spaces for community gathering. Churches were kind of being emptied out. Fraternal organizations, these traditional spaces for meeting were going away. And the old home days were able to kind of fill that void a little bit. On the left, we have volunteers making 5,000 donuts in one morning to sell to the people of the town. And this town has less than 1,000 people, so people are eating a lot of donuts. And on the right, we have the Twice Around parade, which goes around the town square twice because otherwise it just wouldn't be long enough. And these are things that have, become so important to the town over a number of years. I actually spoke with one of the organizers of the Sherman Old Home Day a couple days ago on Facebook, and she said, this year at the Twice Around parade, we couldn't get all the floats on it at one time. So even though these things seem to be on the out now, the old home days are still finding a purpose and really tailoring themselves to the specific needs of their towns. Rather than just trying to, get people back, they're saying, what if that's not the solution for revitalization? What if the solution for revitalization is to focus on the people that live here now? That's all. Thank you so much.
Do we have any questions here in the room?
I was curious, did you had Rhode Island in there? Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut were vastly at the top, versus the bottom three. Does Connecticut have them?
They do. They have fewer kind of for as many towns as they have, but they do have them. Yeah.
So is it more prevalent in the Northern States?
It is. It is more prevalent in the northern states. And I think actually the Foster, Rhode Island one is interesting. It's the only old home day in Rhode Island. And Foster is interesting because it's one of the few rural towns in Rhode Island. Rhode Island is, predominantly suburban and urban. And so I think it's telling that there's something about Foster that, they're clinging to something about this rural identity. And that's, I think, part of why it's important that it be an agricultural fair as well.
Anything else?
I was just curious, when you were talking about like the governor's town that promoted all of this and was kicking it off even after all the other stuff happened. But I was kind of curious about like, what do you suppose the actual audience for a lot of these sort of events would be? Because I mean, I can imagine like my grandma being like, I didn't have to be all the time. I'm still here. So I'm a little curious about like that sort of.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because when you first made this call, there was a great deal of enthusiasm because in a lot of these rural towns, they had this feeling of, we are being left behind, right? And we need to do something to get people back. And so there was kind of this buy-in at that time, or this idea that we should try and lure people back, remind them what they're missing. And that wasn't uniform everywhere, but it is interesting to look at the early old home days because while they happened from time to time in urban areas, it was much more prevalent in rural areas. And these are the towns that still have them as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else have any questions?
I have a question. I have a question. So much of this nostalgia was from a male perspective. Was there a female perspective at all?
Yes, no, many of the organizers in the Old Home Association were women. But I do think it's telling that there is something that's very kind of masculinist about this certain view of nostalgia that comes from these nostalgic artifacts that we get, right? Where the home is the lost love, the lost young woman, or the mother, which creates this really weird tension between, the man who is leaving and coming back, and the home, which is the feminine figure itself. Which I think is something that's worth problematizing, right? This idea that the rural sphere, the domestic sphere, is a feminine sphere only, and that women aren't leaving and coming back, which of course they were, right? But they very much were also moving to cities to work in industry, moving into Massachusetts to work in factories and so forth. But there is certainly a kind of masculine turn to this specific kind of nostalgia, which I think a lot of that has been undone.
Has that changed then? In Old Home Day celebrations today?
Yeah, most of the organizers that I saw for Old Home Days today are women and are kind of holders of tradition in their town. So the woman that I was talking to in Sherman, Maine, Rose Bragdon, is in her late 80s and has lived in Sherman her entire life and has been running the Old Home Day. And now I don't think she's leading it anymore, but is still intimately involved and has been doing it for years and years and years. So and I think that's also part of this change of it being important for the residents themselves rather than just as an instrument to draw people back. And I think that gendered element is also important in that changing of how it works.
Anything else? Anyone have any other questions, either in person or on Teams? You can unmute yourself or put a question in the chat. Well, if not, then we can wrap up here tonight. So again, thank you everybody for coming. This was a recorded event, so I will be editing it tomorrow and putting it on our YouTube channel so people can watch it again in the future. Our next upcoming event will be a tree talk that's going to be titled Elm is Me and I Am Elm, Human Nature Entanglements and the Story of the Witch Elm with Ian Groge, which will be Friday, October 17th. And Thomas will put a link in the chat if you would like to learn more and if you would like to register to attend. This lecture is part of our ongoing series to highlight our upcoming exhibition set to open at the Silver Center of the Arts in November called Rooted, A Story of Trees. And I just want to thank you all again for attending. This was a really great event. So thank you so much.